Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies, gentlemen, and those beyond the restrictive gender binary. I'm Bob. I was tasked to tell you on the skills for getting published. I wish I knew. But what I can do is tell you a little bit about how it should work theoretically, and maybe we can crowdsource some ways of getting around it. So as you will all be aware, the way that these things work is that you press the green button and nothing, and then the slide moves. So the way that these things work is that you sit down after you have done your sciencey stuff and you write the paper. The paper goes into a journal, and then the journal takes it to people in the field and asks them questions about how good do they think it is. They then go through a checklist that says, have you done it all right? Is everybody happy with it? They are delighted. And then you get to tell your grandma that you have been published in a magazine called Nature. That is, broadly speaking, utter bollocks. It starts off with you trying to write a paper for a journal that the professor has told you should write it for. A little bit like using scissors to put in a screw, it isn't always entirely the right fit. You then spend about 3 weeks trying to make it fit into the ridiculous requirements of that particular journal, and they feel that they are bouncing it back at least 3 times because you haven't used the right-sized colon in the middle of your sentences, and your heart feels as if it is ripped in two. You then go through the process of peer review, which feels a little bit like having people with big sticks running at you. And at the end of that 6.5 months of agony, they say, go away, we don't want it. Just occasionally, they will come back dangling a little treat in front of you, going, if you comply with everything we have told you and bribe the editor-in-chief, then we might publish you. That's how it really works. So let's go back to the first step in getting published. We're assuming that you've done the researchy bit right. There's a whole other talk on doing researchy bits right. How do you choose what journal to put it in? How do you choose what journal to put it in? Okay, maybe we didn't do this enough in the quiz. That was a question. And mostly, when I ask questions, it's because I'd quite like some answers to them, please. So how do you decide? You obey instructions. So one of the key things is what you are told to do. Yes, that is an overarching thing, absolutely. If there's any degree of influence involved, what factors might go into choosing what journal you're putting things in for? The audience you want to reach. So which bit of the audience are you going for? Are you going for the clinicians, make a difference on the ground? Are you going for the scientist, get your kudos up? Are you going for the highest, most glistening thing so that you too can be the CCLG Person of the Year? Why are you doing this and what audience are you aiming for? Pick the journal because of your audience. So if the professor's given you some opportunity, you're thinking about, okay, I'll go for these sorts of Journals, because this is the audience I want to get the message to. How do you decide after that? Impact factor. What is impact factor?
The average number of citations on paper in a year in that journal.
Sort of, yes. It's a made-up number by made-up people about a made-up thing. How did they make it up? Well, from January through to December, they take all of the things that count as an article. If it's got under a certain number of words and under a certain number of references at the end, it isn't an article. Then they count the number of times that something from the journal, not the articles, just something from the journal has been cited. The idea being that the more times things from the journal are cited compared to the number of things that are published in it, it must be better. So some journals say, of course you can publish with us if you cite a number of articles from our journal. This is known as extreme dodginess in journal circles, but still sometimes happens. Does impact factor reflect the truth of the impact of a journal?
It's not too bad, is it?
So speaks someone who has a high impact factor journal or has research that goes into high impact factor journals. Unlike the sociologist looking from the other side of the room. Yeah, it sort of vaguely correlates. Vaguely. After all, we can all remember, actually probably some of us weren't born, but there was this thing where some dodgy UK bloke said that MMR caused autism. That went in a high impact factor journal and had quite a lot of impact in stopping people getting autism. No, it wasn't stopping autism, was it? It was creating vaccine-less children with epidemics and death. Yeah. There is a relation, but what exactly that relation is dubious. However,
It's how you measure impact.
how do you measure impact? Yes, good point. Well, you can do it. I don't know if you've seen this in fun fairs, where they have a boxing ball that hangs down, and then you hit it, and it sees how many bells ring. That's one way of measuring impact. Not that useful for scientific publications. But how do you measure it? And so lots of people have thought of different ways of measuring impact. A lot of academic institutions around the world still use impact factor. And your promotions and your grants and everything is based around the number of impact factory points that you can get. If you are in one of those, it is massively important to go with the high impact factor. If you're not, and within the UK and some other institutions, then impact, as in what changes it made in the world, is something that you need to collate. And that might go into how you choose the journal. There are other things that might play into it as well. We've got what the professor tells you, who you want to talk to, how important the journal is in the ranking of things in the world. What other things might be there in your journal choice?
Does your article fit within the scope of the journal? Will they publish anything? Have they published like that before? Is it within their described remit?
If you want to publish an article on the wibbly bits on the outside of the mesenchymal stem cells that sit alongside an ependymoma, you do not go to the Journal of Applied Sociology. How far out of it is it? If it's the readers you want, but it's not quite the thing they usually publish, where do you go in that sphere? There's an element to think about. What else might there be? You can. Some journals, you can literally email them, write to them, and say, do you take this? And the response usually comes back, we are not making any promises at all. Feel free to fill in our 735-page application and then find it rejected within a few moments. But sometimes they will give you a sane answer. Yep. Any other things that might play into it? Can you just stick it in with the Word document that you wrote it? Practicality? Yep. How much are they going to make you pay in order to get it published or not? Is it peer reviewed? Now let's come back to the importance of peer review in a few minutes. But peer review is considered now to be vital, isn't it? Getting things published in a non-peer reviewed journal? Iffy. Yep. Yeah, open access. So something about the balance between how much money have you got to pay for these things versus is it going to then be open access? Is it going to be accessible to the world? Because some funders, some places, you've got to go open access. Otherwise, you get told off big time. Some other things you might want to think about. Timescales. How long are they going to hang on to your blessed paper for before they tell you no? Because if they tell you no in 3 or 4 days, that's one thing. If they take 11 and a half months to turn round and reject it, that's painful in another way. So something about looking around the turnaround times might influence you. I think the quickest I've ever been rejected from a journal was when I got the no, we're not having your paper email before the automated acknowledgement of submission had arrived. Yet it's still very important that we don't know how to treat constipation well in our patients, despite what the New England Journal of Medicine thinks. All of those things go into choosing which journal to pick. And that is the first of your big choices. Then you have to write it. Clearly, writing requires you to put on your clever specs. Just look around the audience. Those wearing specs are clearly cleverer than those who don't. Put on your clever specs, grab a really good coffee, sit there, looking intellectual, and thinking, start writing something. But, as some of you may remember from last time, it is important that what you write is both concise, but also unambiguous. And you may remember that this particular sentence is not unambiguous at all. It is ultimately ambiguous, because depending on which of the words you emphasize, you actually get a quite different meaning as you go through the sentence. But can you be concise? Can you be world-changing in as little as 630 words or so? Oh, yes, you can. Because the paper that didn't include one of the important authors, Crick and Watson, did it in about 630 words in Nature. That's it. That's the entirety of it. That's not just the abstract, that's the paper. So when you're complaining, you've only got 3,000 words to describe whatever it is you're describing, think what we need to do is follow the example of Watson and Crick. Clearly, we reject any female collaborators because that's what they did. We claim it's all our own work, and we don't get it peer-reviewed. Not peer-reviewed! The whole structure of DNA falls to the floor, and we have nothing to work on, which makes all that molecular characterization of CNS tumours so much easier. Now we know that it was all based on a lack of peer-reviewed stuff in the first place. Yeah, but seriously, peer review now is considered massively, massively important. But that is a tradition that has arisen. When the BMJ did some work on peer reviewing and looked to see what was the benefit of peer reviewing, did it improve the quality of clinical science research? Clinical research, not the lab-based stuff. This was clinical research, because the BMJ publishes clinical research rather than sciencey sorts of research. It found it improved beautifully the quality of the introduction and the discussion, not the quality of the science. Statistical review, that made a difference, not the peer review. That is heretical, and we are not allowed to say it in public. But it's out there. You've got to get through it. It's a hoop. It might also be quite useful at times, and certainly within some fields, peer review actually does make a difference, and we'll come on to that as well. Also, when you're writing, think about how you are writing and for what purpose. So, when you're talking about something, do you say, this is a copy of the Babbage engine? It's in the Manchester Science Museum and was made over the course of about 8 months using an integrated system that made it in a sort of a very precise way where they're all cut out at once with computer-aided engineering, whereas the original was made by people tolerating it and rubbing it with files so that it all worked properly. It's made of a composition of steel alongside copper. It has 1,000 or more little gears within it, and it is run by humans. Or do you say, this is a picture of the world's first automatic computer? What message do you want to get across when you're writing particularly about your complexities? How much detail do you go into? Do you introduce an idea by saying, hello, I'm sorry your child's really poorly. They've got some really abnormal cells on their blood film that are large. They have a slightly bluish cytoplasm around the outside. Their nucleus looks sort of squishy in a weird, squishy, heart-shaped way. And frankly, I'm going to have to call in someone from another country to tell me what it is, because my diagnosis was acute leukemia of squishiness. Or do you say, I'm sorry, your child's got a leukemia? What level of complexity do you need to get across? That is what you do in daily practice. It's what you do in writing as well. Get the message across at the right level. And remember to follow the rules. Each journal will have its own rules. These will vary from journal to journal. They may even vary within the journal grouping overall as to what is allowed and what isn't allowed. The fact that no one can come up with a single, unified, sensible system is a travesty, but it is the way it is, and it is the rules we have to play with. At least there is a little bit of sanity that sits behind the journals, and certainly within the majority of clinical research that's out there, there will be guidance on how to write up the sort of study you've got. So have you heard of any of the reporting guidelines for studies? Maybe it's easier if I do this. Have you heard of any reporting guidelines for different sorts of studies? And if so, what are they?
Consulting with my friend here, but I think you need to make some introduction, talk about your methods, your results, and then you discuss them and their importance.
So absolutely. So the overall structure of your paper will almost certainly be something along the lines of introduction into your methods, then into your results, then into a discussion. Absolutely. And you would hope that your abstract would follow that as well. Maybe it will be formalised. You have to put them in those sections. And even if it isn't, you should write it in prose along those lines. Yeah, absolutely. Very, very sensible. Anybody heard of any guidelines to report things with? Yeah, have a guess.
Do you mean like Prisma statement?
Yes.
Systematic review? No.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's the Prisma statement for systematic reviews.
Consort stuff, isn't it?
The
For
consort
RCT,
stuff.
for
Yeah,
RCTs, yeah.
So
Registering clinical trials, people are big on that these days.
they are.
They're too big.
Yeah, we're horrendous for it as methodologists. Yeah. So I'm seeing some blank faces, some oh yeah faces, and some sort of. So, two big elements coming through there. There are reporting guidelines. These are statements that have been pulled together in order that when you write your paper, you contain enough of the very important information that the reader can extract the key elements that help them understand if the science that you're reporting, if the study you're reporting is valid and where its problems are. The consort statement is probably the first one of those. That's how to report clinical trials and has a variety of extensions for different sorts of clinical trials, cluster randomized, in N=1, trials of traditional Chinese medicine, all sorts of extensions. The consort statement. There's one for systematic reviews and evidence synthesis called Prisma. There's one for multivariable prediction models called Tripod, and they're all gathered together in the aegis of the Equator Network. So if you're looking to do or report on a clinical study, go there to look which bits you need to fill in to really get it right. And most journals, when you put in a clinical journal in, a clinical research article in, will have some question along the lines of, have you followed the guideline? And then you have to say yes or no, there isn't a relevant guideline in some circumstances. And then submit your completed checklist alongside the article that you've done. Now that's twofold, that's good. Firstly, as you're going in, filling it in, it gives you a hint to see, have you actually done all the bits that are necessary? And also, it helps the reviewers, because then they can pull it down and go, oh yeah, all right, I feel better now. Yeah. They've filled it in as they go along. So we've got those sorts of guidelines that exist out there that you can look at in order to fill in order to know that you've got the right stuff. Okay, there's a whole load of them that are out there.
The first one.
An entirely sensible answer there of who your boss tells you.
The answer for me, Bob, is yes, I always deserve to be an author. No.
I like high impact factors and I'm always an author. Correlation or causation? But who is an author?
The one you worked on that?
Yes.
Has to be an author, I guess.
Yeah, so working on it is absolutely a key criterion for authorship.
helping with it.
Helping with it.
It's not exactly working on it all the time.
Helping. Bringing coffee, making sure you have clean air.
Knowing the editor-in-chief.
How? Maybe a little bit, perhaps.
Being involved with coming up with the concept, and also I think you have to have read it, and as a minimum.
But I note the uncertainty there. I think you have to have read it.
In an ideal world.
Yeah, I mean, can I just ask you, Bob? So there's some academics in the UK. I don't know if you know them. I could name some very high-profile people,
But don't.
I won't
Because
I
this is
won't
being
name them. I
recorded.
won't name them. But you know, they may have had government positions, all sorts, and they publish probably, I would say, I've looked it up, 100 papers a year. Their name is on 100 papers a year, which is 2 a week. By the way, for people, that's publishing 2 a week. That isn't like writing 2 a week, publishing 2 a week. So do you think those people meet the criteria for authorship, or what do you think? What's your opinion on that?
I think sometimes it's best not to answer a question. But it is fascinating to be asked them, isn't it? And then just mould them internally. Yeah. Any more thoughts on what goes into a criteria for an authorship, rather than trying to get me sacked? Funding the research. Okay, that's an interesting one. Yeah.
Actually, there are guidelines for this too, and you can. I don't know the name of them, but if you have somebody that wants to be an author, you can refer to those, and that's pretty useful. So you can say, no, sadly, you're not an author.
So it's always useful to have a plant in the audience. No. Yeah, absolutely right. You are absolutely right. There are guidelines from the International Committee of Journal Medical Editors, the ICMJ. They did not think about getting a really nicely pronounceable like Equator or Comet or See Impact Now. I mean, surely See Impact Now, that was fantastic. They started with that, didn't they? And then they worked backwards to, how can we make this look like we haven't just invented it because this is what we want to get them across? This lot, rubbish. This is the official guidelines. Basically, you have to fill 4 criterion to be an author. You have to have worked on the project to some extent. And it can be that you came up with the initial concept. And for many people that run labs, that is the loose interpretation of how number 1 gets in. Initial concept, design, doing the work, doing the analysis, that sort of thing. Something intellectual that goes into it. You do have to have read it, at least reviewed it, and you need to agree that that final thing is, and if you're an author, you should be taking responsibility or be prepared to take responsibility for the whole of the paper. That isn't to say explaining every single sentence in the paper, but taking responsibility for it, having an understanding and an ownership of it. It is not meant to be a way of stopping people that you've fallen out with during the project from qualifying as authors. So if you started off doing it with another person who you now hate, you are not allowed to just not send them the paper so they can't be an author. That is cheating the rules. They've specifically got a section in the rules further down to say you're not allowed to do that, because clearly people were doing. It's sometimes helpful and depends a little bit on who you're working with and what you know about them, but it's sometimes helpful to agree the criteria for authorship before you start working. I'll let your diplomatic selves work out if the people you work with need that sort of managing or not. Now, who's got a birthday in February? Put your hands up. There's no one in this room with a birthday in February. Is that because February is a really difficult word to translate? That has to be a near miracle.
We chose the candidate by the correspondence. But 0 is also an answer.
What about March? Excellent. The March lot, you're submitting to the New England Journal of Medicine. Who here? It's not going to be New England Journal of Medicine, the next lot, I'll tell you. Mainly because you've already got that. Who here has a birthday in December? Okay. You three? Yeah. You're submitting to Nature Genetics. Who's got a birthday in July? Oh. So many July babies! Oh, that's lovely. You're getting to submit to pediatric blood and cancer. Oh. It gets worse. Who's got a birthday in November? And you three are submitting to the Archives Diseases of Childhood. Now you lot, in your little groups, not the rest of you, you're all out and off, or the New England Journal lot, you can either scan this code or you can go on Google and type the words dice roll in. It will get you to a dice roller, which is a dice that's rolling. It's not very complicated, really. New England Journal lot, the rest of you that have had the birthdays identified, it's coming, yeah? New England Journal lot, I want you to roll a 10-sided dice. Each of you roll a 10-sided dice. Nature Genetics lot, I'd like you to roll a 10-sided dice as well. Pediatric blood and cancer lot, you get a 4-sided dice to roll. And the archives lot, you get a normal dice, a 6-sided dice to roll. So roll your dices. Dices. One, just one. The New England Journal look like they're concentrating really hard, which is good because it's a really high impact factor. Okay, New England Journal. Does anybody have the number 7 on their roll? You have all been rejected out of hand without peer review. About 90% of papers that go to New England Journal, out the door. Nature Genetics lot. Do any of you have the number 7 or 2 on your roll? You too have been out the door. 80% don't even get anywhere near peer review. Pediatric blood and cancer. Do any of you have the number 1 on your roll? You're all through peer review because about 75% of papers that get sent to pediatric blood and cancer get some degree of peer review. Really small number get sent away at that first turn. And the archives lot? Any of you got a 1 or a 2 on your roll? I'm afraid your paper didn't get through to peer review in the archives, which is, you know, I don't know what it was you wrote, because 60% get through, but... So of those that got through, once you're through peer review, your chances go up massively. New England Journal, of those that get through to peer review, about 1 in 4 then go on to get published. With Nature Genetics, it's probably about 1 in 6. There's a lot more sort of, I don't like it, it's got the wrong K number in it, or whatever it is that geneticists say. Pediatric Blood and Cancer and archives, about half get published when you're through to peer review on the far side of it. That initial decision as to whether to go to peer review or not is actually probably the biggest decision that is there. So how do you influence it? How do you get to move through the fire that is the receiving editor? Any thoughts? You follow up on something where the editor was in the audience and looked excited at the stuff you were talking about. You make sure you've told them who you are, give them a business card, exchanged numbers across Bluetooth, and then you write going, "Hi, Ed, I met you at that conference." Insert picture here. Yes, personal contact and or bribery. Brilliant. Any other ways? Learning from rejection, yeah.
Yeah. Now I will write a very sexy cover letter.
Certainly works with some people.
But the reality of it is also that if you want to publish in these high-impact journals, you need to have high-impact people on your paper.
Absolutely. When we do the meta-ethnography and when we do the meta-research around who gets through, who gets published, who doesn't get published, if you have a female-sounding name, you are about a third less likely to be published if you're the first author. If you come from Africa, you are about half as likely to be published if you are the first author. Now, those may be accounted for by some other factors, but there is a strong element of structural misogyny and structural racism within the establishment. We can work against it, but it's there. There was an attempt to go down the line of double-blinded peer review. Doesn't stop getting through the first fire. And double-blinded peer review, when you're through to that point, actually makes really very little difference on the far side of it. But how do we get through this first fire? This is something that, as journal editors and editorial boards, we are trying very hard to get around. But the facts are there, and we need to work against them. How might we do that? Editors need to do something about that. But how might we get our journals and pieces through as we stand? Well, we can use the technique of the Victorian authors and just use initials rather than using names, so that then it can be assumed that you are a man writing. Might work. Worked for novel authors for years. What we can do is we can write a cover letter that says why this is important, but possibly more importantly, we can make sure that the abstract gets across the message. And we do it, as was suggested, introduction, methods, key results, discussion. Keep it very tight, make it sound like this is something that is meaningful and has true impact, not just impact factor impact. Because rarely, no, that's an exaggeration, because often a lot of the decision is made within the cover letter and abstract rather than the whole of the paper itself. So the idea of the sexy cover letter, the beautifully written abstract, is probably the best way to get around it as far as we can do as authors. We can do as editors, can do an awful lot more than that, but we have to work on it. And then you get to peer review. Not entirely sure if everybody did have Fungus the Bogeyman in their childhood books, but it was certainly widespread in the UK. Well, I mean, you know, there's always a reviewer too. Peer review, when you look at it, tends to come back with comments that are fair, maybe constructive, and will actually develop your paper. Some that are unreasonable or frankly wrong, and some that are purely stylistic. Essentially, I don't like the way you wrote that. Or, please can you add 33 extra tables detailing every time you had coffee during this experiment. That's probably, graphically size-wise, a representation of the sorts of volumes of comments that come in when you look through peer reviews. As the recipient of peer reviews, it tends to feel like it's this that comes through, with a minor amount of fairness, an awful lot of unreasonableness, and what? Style? What? How do we deal with them? Well, we should deal with them all politely. So it is not reasonable to turn round and go, reviewer 2 sucks, I am not regarding anything they say at all. It won't get you anywhere with the associate editor that's going to review this. Tend to start with, thank you for that interesting comment, or, whilst it would have been interesting if we'd done an experiment that was completely different than the one that we actually did, and more like the one you wanted us to do, we didn't. But try to make it sound, you know, measured. You can reject peer review comments. You do not have to agree with them. You can rebut them, but do so with sense and sensitivity. If it is a style issue, then put in, we've kept it this way because the journal style is. Or, this is how we've chosen to do it. If the editor wishes to change things because of the journal style, we will do. Make it discursive on those stylistic comments. Agree and change on the fair comments, and disagree politely with the ones that you think are unreasonable or wrong. Much of the response to peer review then may not go back out to peer review. It may be seen by a small number of editors to make a final decision rather than going back out again. Sometimes it goes back out again and then comes back again for another round, and out again and back again for another round. And I don't know how anybody else has, but I once had 6 lots of revisions and was rejected, which stung quite badly at the end of all of that. But generally speaking, when you're up to your second or third, you've either just got to the point where they finally understood what it is you're doing, because you wrote it so unclearly in the first place, or they're being incredibly pernickety and you're nearly there. There will be some that still get rejected at this point. But then you will find the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and your paper will eventually be published somewhere with perseverance. Make sure, where possible, you make it open access or openly accessible. So if it's not an open access journal, then try to get it in your departmental or institutional repository. Most places will let you do an unformatted version of the manuscript now. Most journals will let you do an unformatted version of the manuscript after a certain period of time, which can then be found by people even if it's not an open access journal. Check with your library often, who will know the rules of the various publishing houses as to how soon you can make that available. Make sure that what you do is you put information out there that is accessible to as many people as possible. So if you get the chance, make it pretty and multicoloured and attractive and turn it into a lay abstract. Use Kudos or one of the other services to rewrite it so that normal people can understand, not just molecular pathologists of the CNS of the posterior fossa. Just occasionally, someone will ask you to write something, genuinely ask you to write something, a commissioned piece. If you've got the time, take that precious gift and work with it. But it doesn't mean they're definitely going to publish it if you write some rubbish. But think about taking those commissions. On the whole, though, those emails that come through will largely be sharks beneath you that are trying to swallow you up whole in the land of predatory publishing. And what happens if you've got a journal article that almost certainly works, but they've never seen it before? Until white Europeans went to New Zealand, there was a feeling that all swans had to be white because no one had ever seen a black swan, and a black swan could not exist. And then they found them when they invaded New Zealand, bringing a variety of viral diseases and destroying much of the local culture. Yay, colonialism. But it might be that you've got an article that actually works brilliantly for a thing, but isn't the sort that they're used to. That's the point where your negotiation sales pitch goes in. If you've got an ID journal and you're going to do a qualitative study of why people don't stop antibiotics, you're going to have a hard sell, but it might still be the right journal to put it in after all. Remember preprints, which now absolutely exist, and then there's another way of getting your research out in the world so it can be seen while it's going through the 11-month process. And always remember that it is because of the young people and children that we treat that we are doing all this, and so where possible, make sure the importance to them is clear within your writing and within the studies that you do. Getting published is very straightforward. You just have to choose the thing wisely, write concisely, and roll lucky, I'm afraid. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob, for this inspiring talk. And I'm so happy you put in a rainbow, because I was going to make a remark on not having a rainbow. I don't know, we're a bit short on time, but we have room for one question. Harm?
I got nearly every day several requests for writing papers to all kinds of journals. What's the mechanism behind all those journals? I mean, what makes them alive?
Yeah. So the majority of the predatory journals that exist are either not real or semi-real. And there might be a small office above not a dry cleaners, it's a burger place in San Alto, California or somewhere, that apparently 80 journals are run out of if you actually look at the source of where many of these come from. And they clearly just put the odd web page up, get people to pay £1,000 or €1,000 or whatever. And their business model is essentially a confidence trick. I have to say, I tend to bin everything that says, please would you write for? And that's how I missed an actual invite to write for paediatric blood and cancer at one point. And it was only when the second email came direct from a person's account rather than the journal account that I realised it wasn't actually spam. Yeah, and they do it by getting your email address off other papers. You know, really, my views in obstetrics and gynecology are not of any importance at all.
Bob, thank you also from my side for this brilliant talk. I have a question. What would you do if you're the co-author of a paper in which you were significantly involved, but it's pure rubbish, and the first and last author refuse your suggested modifications?
I would feel very, very bad and awkward, but I would ask a question about it in a public setting, so that hopefully it would then embarrass the senior and possibly first author that are in the room. And then what would I do? Oh God, how much do I need to work with the first and senior author again? It would be a real moral dilemma. I think I would withdraw authorship, and I have done very occasionally from very multi-author papers. Said actually, I don't think that I qualify to be an author on this paper, and then stepped away from it.
But only yourself, or also your patients who are part of this research?
It hasn't been with me something where it's been patient directly related. It's been ancillary. It does make it very difficult. Mm.
Thanks very much for a great talk. Any tips or advice for authorship when you're trying to involve patients or experts by experience in publishing?
Yes.
We're struggling with this at the moment. But
Yes.
I'm delighted if you had any ideas.
Yes, it's a nightmare. It's now at least on the sort of the journal editor's sphere of it's a nightmare. There's no mechanism. They can't input themselves properly. They don't have an institution that is Ringwald compliant. There's all so the technique that I have used and the technique that gets used on me is emails to the info or whatever and the editor, handling editor and editor-in-chief, saying this person is expert by experience, it's patient involvement, they have significantly contributed to it, this is why they are authors, because they've done all of these steps, but we can't get past your computer system. In terms of involving them in the act of writing, I think that's where you've got lots of different things depending on how old they are, the intellectual capability of those people, and their sort of familiarity with the things that you're doing. And there are a variety of techniques that can be used, from the straightforward, they may well have a doctorate in engineering or something and be very happy with writing academic papers. It might be that they're not, and that they're a 13-year-old that's just used to doing sort of short answers for their GCSEs. So you use different techniques, clearly. But in getting the sort of the submission part through there, and often there's some way you can put a contributorship. So some element of what did the various authors do for this paper. And in there, it's very useful to be able to put that in there as well.